Tēnā koutou. Ina ki te mōhio koe, ko wai koe. I anga mai koe e hia, ki te mōhio koe ki te anga atu ki hia. If you know who you are and where you are from, you know where you are going. I bring to you this morning this treasured whakatauki, this Māori proverb. The kaupapa behind this saying bridges on the importance of knowing who we come from and where we come from. Understanding our identity is linked to understanding our future. Knowledge and stories of where we come from, knowing our whakapapa, provide us with the insight into who we are. And these treasures of knowledge can guide us on our way to knowing and understanding where we are going. So this is an important whakatauki that I bring to you as we continue together on our journey through the Easter story. A story that connects us to our whakapapa as Christians. A story that helps guide us to where we are going. Last week, Steve Dunn took us through the events of Jesus' triumphant yet humble entry into the city of Jerusalem. Jesus' popularity, however, did not reach many of the religious leaders. Their patience with him had run out. Jesus had to go, if you know what I mean. Jesus, being aware of his unpopularity, retreated into a small city of Bethany, a small town not too far away from the city of Jerusalem, to await the festival which he had arrived for, the festival of unleavened bread, or as some of us might know it better, as the Passover. The Easter story and the Easter message are often retold year after year without fail in the lead up to the Easter holiday. And it only seems fitting. It's a pretty big story with a pretty big message. But there was another big story with a big message before the Easter story. It was a story at the centre of the festival Jesus had arrived for. And we know this story is pretty big and important because it warranted itself its own 7 to 8 day celebration. And it wasn't just once every little while, it was every single year. This festival was one where Jews who lived near and far to Jerusalem, they would pick up their families and they would travel every year if they could. The Passover story sets the scene for our Easter story. This week-long festival was dedicated to the remembrance and the celebration of God and the promises that he has kept. The Passover festival, or the festival of unleavened bread, is still celebrated today in Judaism, and also by some Messianic Jews. As a holiday, the Passover commemorates the departure of the nation of Israel from Egypt, and it marked the birth of the Jewish people, a nation led by Moses over 3,000 years ago. It is as much a celebration of spiritual freedom as physical liberation from slavery. Exodus 6, verses 6 to 7, give us a brief overview of the promise of God to the Israelites at the start of the Exodus story. Therefore, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression and will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from your oppression in Egypt. And we see God's miraculous rescue mission play out through the first section of the book of Exodus, our second book in the Bible. Now, the first few days of this week-long festival were often the highlights. For these few days, families and friends would flock to the temple with their lambs, give them over to the priest to be sacrificed. They would hang around and hear the Exodus story. And after a long day at the temple, they would gather again together as families and friends to prepare for the all-important Seder meal, where they would again, over food, over whānau, they would retell the story of the Exodus. Preparations for the Seder meal would include a whole lot of food preparation. They would pull out the special Seder plates, like we do for our Christmas dinners. They would set the table and procure enough cushions to recline on as they ate. This meal was not like any ordinary family dinner or any ordinary holiday meal we might know of. This was a very ordered affair, 15 steps to follow. Each thing had its own order and its own purpose. This meal was also a family-friendly event for all ages. Children were not given their own special table with the plastic cups and plastic plates because you don't want them to break anything. They were a central part of the meal. Their voices, their inquisitive nature at the Seder table was nurtured. They even had a special game to partake in. One of the adults would wrap pieces of the unleavened bread and they would hide it around the house for the children to find. The children would go out and find this bread and then hold it for ransom until the end, when they would be given a gift in exchange for bread. Kind of like how we send kids out on an Easter egg hunt, except for we don't get the Easter eggs. Each part of the meal had an important symbolism and meaning. And it would be explained throughout the night as children asked the questions, and the father or the head of the family would answer them. The questions that these children would ask and have answered were reminders to all at the table of the Exodus story, the good and the uncomfortable. Children would ask questions like, why do we eat unleavened bread or bread that has no yeast in it? This bread called matzo, I might be saying that wrong, but that's how it's spelled here. It is eaten in remembrance to the Exodus, when Israelites fled Egypt at a moment's notice with their dough, which had not had any yeast added to it. They are reminded of the quickness that in the time that they had to get out, to go. Another question, why do we eat bitter herbs? Bitter herbs, usually horseradish, are included in the meal to represent the bitterness of slavery. Why do we dip our food in liquid? At the beginning of the meal, a piece of potato was dipped in salt water to recall the tears the Jews shed as slaves. Why do we eat in a reclining position? In ancient times, people who were free got to recline on the floor or on sofas while they ate. They did this to remind themselves that they are now free. On the first night of Passover, families and friends gathered together to remember their ancestors and therefore themselves being set free from slavery and becoming God's nation. They remember who they are, God's people, where they come from, up and out of Egypt, up and out of slavery, and into freedom, and into new life with the promise of new land and new laws. On following days, in the synagogue and the temple, people would tell of the celebrations after the new nation of Israel had crossed the Jordan River. They would continue the story in Exodus of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments and God's covenant with the Israelites, of the resurrection of the valley of dry bones, symbolizing the spiritual rebirth of Israel, of the departure from Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea, and a summary of the laws and rituals of Passover. On the last day of the festival, a passage from the book of Isaiah is read, which tells of the Messianic era, or the Passover of the future. By the end of the festival, they are reminded of where they are going. Now, Jesus, who was a devout Jew, celebrated alongside the rest of his fellow Israelites these festivals. For 33 years, he took part in the Passover, all while being the Passover of the future, the Messiah. So let's turn back to our Easter story, to Mark 14, verses 12 to 16, where we read of the preparation being made for Jesus' group of disciples for this important night, for the last Passover. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owners of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?'" Jesus made plans and preparations for the Passover meal in great secrecy. His popularity with the religious leaders had run out. We see in this passage Jesus sending ahead 2 of his disciples to find a man carrying a jug of water. The instructions were quite odd, as men didn't often carry jugs of water. It would be hard to miss. It seems that tonight's meal was to be an exclusive and secret event, invite only, and in a private location. We know of some of the events that happened during this night, but there are some things that we might not know that we can maybe assume based on tradition. We might assume that Jesus followed most of the order of the Seder meal. He might have hidden some bread for children to find, partaken in the retelling of the story, sung traditional praises, hymns, songs, and blessings at the appropriate times of the meal. Some of the things that we do know as we go through the story in Mark 14 is that he called out a betrayer at the table, one of the 12, who most of us know to be Judas, and if you didn't, I'm very sorry about the spoiler alert, it just happens. We also see another strange thing happening at the table. Jesus, in the midst of a historical meal of remembrance, he introduces a new one. We know this meal by many names: the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, communion, and we know the 2 elements that make up the meal, the bread and the wine, or in our case, the grape juice. In Mark verses 22 to 25, we read of Jesus' new meal for his followers. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them, and said, "Take this, my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never drink again the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it in the new kingdom of God." In light of the events to follow, the next morning through to the afternoon, we see this, we hear of this, we read this. Jesus' body was broken, his blood was poured out. It fits with the meal he just shared with his disciples. Sorry, that was another spoiler. The Last Supper seems to be a fitting title for the chapter of our Easter story. But it was by no means the last meal for him or his disciples. But it was the start of a new remembrance meal, the first of the new Passover, when Jesus the Messiah came to set his people free. But not just his people, but all people. Free from death, from sin, offered forgiveness, brought at no cost of our own, but paid in full with the final Passover lamb. Jesus, the man, the Son of Man, the Son of God himself, on a Roman cross. It's been over 3,000 years since the Exodus event, since Israel was freed from slavery in Egypt by God, signifying the first Passover. And it's been over 2,000 years since a man no one can dispute once lived, or died, or rose again, had instituted a new Passover meal. Our Easter story leads us to here and now. It leads us to today. Like the Jews, we remember the promises of God and who Jesus is through a sacred meal and the retelling of a historical story. Ina ki te mohio koe, ko wai koe. I anga mai koe I hia. Ki te mohio koe, ki te anga atu ki hia. If you know who you are and where you are going, you know where you are from, you know where you are going. The Passover meal leads us to the story of Jesus and to the story of his communion. It is within this historical meal, the whakapapa of where it came from, we can see where we are going. So where are we going? As we come again and again to the communion table, some month after month like us, and some week after week like others, we come face to face with the one whose body was broken for us, whose blood was poured out for us. We come kanohi te kanohi. We come face to face with Jesus Christ, the world's Saviour, Redeemer, the Prince of Peace, the unblemished Lamb. And we remind ourselves of promises of God, the ones being fulfilled and the ones yet to be fulfilled. It is at this communion table we are transported into his story, from the very beginning to the death, and then again into life. At this table, we join all of the Christians, disciples of Jesus, gone before us. And we join all of the ones that come after us. And we share in the meal where the we becomes bigger than the me. Just like the Jews, our Passover meal reminds us of the reality before. When we come to the communion table, we are reminded that we too were once slaves. We are reminded of the pain and the shame and the hurt our sin caused us and caused others. And then we are also reminded that we have taken cover under the blood of the Lamb. We have escaped our captivity. God now moves freely in our lives. We see him, we watch for him, We wait for him together. And we follow him into the promised land. We then face the challenge to live new lives in a way that is free and that offers freedom, not oppression. To live a life where we forgive others and give grace where we have once received it ourselves. To show compassion where we once too have been shown compassion. So when we partake in the communion meal again, when we come to the table, may we remember the invitation to us to come face to face, kanohi ki te kanohi, with Jesus, to remember who he was, who he is, to remember who we are, where we are from, and invite ourselves to ask the question, Jesus, where to from here? Where can I follow you this week? Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Lord, thank you for your meal. Thank you for what you gave to us these many years ago. Thank you for what it reminds us of, but more importantly, who it reminds us of. You, and what it spurs us to be in you. Lord, thank you for this church and the blessing that they are. May we come together again to seek your face, to follow you. Amen.